Hello, thank you for tuning in. Today we will hear from forestry experts to discuss forest health challenges with Glade Park landowners. As most of you know, Glade Park is a pinyon, juniper, and sagebrush park on Pinyon Mesa, just south of Grand Junction, Colorado. My name is David Varner, and I work at Colorado West Land Trust. We oversee a substantial amount of conserved land on Pinyon Mesa, and many of our landowners up there are concerned for their forests. Over the past 5 to 10 years, there's been a substantial amount of tree death across several forest types, and folks are concerned about wildfire, the impacts on wildlife, and they want to know if there's something they can do. In response, we've reached out to some experts who have generously agreed to share their knowledge with us. In just a moment, we'll hear from forest health researchers and practitioners on subjects like forest insects, wildfire prevention, and the role of forests in the ecosystem. This is an extraordinary opportunity to learn about the long view of forest health, advice on how to manage forests, and prevent wildfire from damaging your property. Regarding the video recording of this webinar, you'll notice that there are sections time-stamped into the video's progress bar below. These bookmarks correspond to the speakers and the presentations that I'll now describe, so you can use them to quickly navigate to speakers and the sections you want. First, we're going to hear from Bill Romme and Tony Vorster of Colorado State University. Bill will provide us with an overview of pinyon-juniper and aspen forest ecology, and Tony will clarify some of the terms we use to characterize how we deal with ecological change. Then we'll hear from Kamie Long, Colorado State Forest Service, and P.K. Kieran, who is a BLM fire management specialist. Kamie will tell us everything we need to know about the Pinyon Ips beetle and how to manage trees infested with this insect. Then PK will tell us what we can do to protect structures from wildfire and other fire-wise concepts. Lastly, there is an informative question and answer session where presenters respond to inquiries put forth by Glade Park landowners. I want to thank everyone for their effort creating the content for this webinar, landowners for participating, and to the viewers, I hope you get as much out of this as I have. Thank you for watching.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Kenyon. I am Bill Romme. I'm a professor of forestry and fire ecology at CSU. I'm retired, but I'm continuing to work part-time. And one of the things that I'm spending most of my time and energy on these days is working with the Western Ranch Management and Ecosystem Stewardship Program. This is a brand new program that we just launched at CSU. And our aim is to help train students who can then go out and deal with all of the complex issues involved in managing a Western ranch in the 21st century. Tony, who will talk a little later, is also working on that, along with Bob Sturdivant, who will talk later. And if you have any questions about that program, please feel free to contact any one of us when we're done. I'd like to start off, though, by giving a broad overview of the basic ecology of the PJ and aspen ecosystems on the Uncompahgre Plateau. The main point I'm going to make is going to be no surprise to all of you. I'm going to emphasize that these are not homogeneous kinds of vegetation, but rather there's a lot of variability within each of them. We don't have time to go through all of that variability, but what I'm going to do is for each of them, I'm going to highlight two important, contrasting, and widespread forms, if you will, of those two vegetation types. I'm going to draw on the work that I have done on the Uncompahgre Plateau and surrounding areas, and also from the literature. And I've done quite a bit on the Uncompahgre down at the south and central portions of it, but I'm sorry to say I've never been to Glade Park itself. So if I say something that you know from your own local experience is not correct for the Glade Park area, please tell me that during the question and answer period so that I can improve my understanding. So let's talk about Pinyon-juniper woodlands. First of all, I'd like to talk about two very different kinds of PJ woodlands. They're the expanding woodlands where we see young trees moving into sagebrush or meadows. And then there are the old growth woodlands that we see in other places. Let's talk first about the expanding woodlands. This is sometimes referred to as encroachment or invasion of meadows. I don't care for those terms myself because they kind of make it sound like there's something unnatural and inappropriate happening. And in fact, it's just a natural ecological process. Trees germinate and grow where they can. And I think one reason that we're seeing a lot of this having occurred during the last 100 years is because the 20th century was really a good period of time for trees. It was a good time to be a tree. There weren't very many fires. There was a drought in the 50s, but it didn't last very long. And in fact, the period from the mid 70s until the early 90s was actually one of the wettest periods in the Four Corners region in the last several centuries. So the climate was very conducive to trees and there weren't many fires. I would also point out that in some places, if you look closely, you can see that what looks like tree expansion is actually a place that is a former woodland that got chained during the 1960s and 70s. And when the trees are coming into there, it's really more of a recovery of a disturbed woodland rather than an actual expansion into a meadow. So, question that we're going to want to talk about later on, but I'll just begin the conversation. Is expansion into meadows and sagebrush a problem? Well, clearly, yes, it's a problem if it's really impairing something, if it's impairing your grazing or sage-grouse habitat, or if it's increasing fire risk to your fences or to your infrastructure. If it really poses a threat, then yes, it's a problem. But on the other hand, if it's not really impairing any of those kinds of values, then it probably is not a big priority, or at least is probably not one of the most important problems that we need to deal with. Again, it's a natural process. These woodlands have probably expanded and contracted periodically over the last 1,000 years. They expand during climatically favorable periods when there aren't many fires, and they contract when it dries out and there's extensive burning. And we have recently come out of a period of expansion, but the way the climate is going and the way mortality is occurring, I expect that this expansion is going to slow and might even reverse as climate change continues. But let me switch now to talk about the other kind of PJ woodlands, and these are very different. These are the old growth woodlands, also called persistent woodlands. And the reason I call it persistent is because these are the ones that grow on sites that are especially favorable for pinyon and juniper. They're really not very good sites for other kinds of vegetation, but they're great for PJ. You see them very often on rocky sites, but they're not exclusively on rocky sites. And the key thing is that they predate the 20th century. They're not an artifact of the 20th century. These are places where the trees have been there for centuries. If you look down in the lower right-hand corner of the PowerPoint, there's a picture there of Mesa Verde that was taken, I think it was 1892. And look at that dense woodland up on the top of the mesa. That was already a dense woodland back long before Smokey the Bear. I have spent quite a bit of time in that exact woodland, and it contains pinyon trees that are 300 and 400 years old, and junipers that appear to be even older. Now, these woodlands have gotten more dense. More trees have come in during the 20th century, again, because it was such a good time for trees. But the point is that these are natural woodlands. This is the natural state for these kinds of vegetation, and they're not artifacts of fire suppression like some other vegetation types are. Historically, these woodlands rarely burned. Lightning and people have always ignited fires, but those fires tend only to spread during extreme weather conditions. Most of the time, they just ignite a single tree or burn just a very small patch of ground. but they don't spread unless it's really dry and the winds are really strong. Now, under those kinds of extreme conditions, the fires can really spread fast. They really burn hot. They usually kill all the trees. What they're doing is they're burning the trees. They're really not spreading along the ground. They're spreading from one tree crown to the next tree crown. And it generates a tremendous amount of heat. And when a fire like this occurs in one of these old growth woodlands, takes a very long time for the trees to grow back, decades or centuries. There are places in Mesa Verde, for example, that burned in the 1930s, and there's still hardly a pinyon or a juniper to be found there. And I emphasize that this is not a situation like ponderosa pine forests, where low intensity surface fires used to thin the forest and sustain an open canopy. These just don't carry low intensity surface fires. They don't have the fine fuels for that. Fires, when they do burn, tend to blow from tree crown to tree crown. And in fact, historically, insects had a greater influence on these forests than fires did. So important to stress that these are not like ponderosa pine forests. But these old growth Pinyon-juniper woodlands are really important biodiversity. The Colorado Biodiversity Assessment found that they support a lot of really special plant and animal species. And they're also just really fascinating ecological communities. They have symbiotic interactions and really fascinating natural history stories. As just one example, the pinyon jay needs pinyon trees. It's a major food source. But the pinyon tree also needs the pinyon jay just as much, because the jays are the main agent that disperse and plant their seeds. The jays collect the seeds when the cones ripen. They collect more than they can eat, and they bury the excess in the ground to come back and get them later. But they always overlook a few. And it turns out that where they bury them in the soil is just an ideal depth for a pinyon seed to germinate. So the jays and the trees are really co-linked. And there are many, many other natural history stories like that in these woodlands. These old growth woodlands, I think, are really threatened right now. Severe drought, high temperatures. We're seeing unusually frequent large fires. This is a vegetation type that is not adapted to fire. Fire does not restore them, fire destroys them. And we're seeing lots and lots of fire, probably more than was typical during the historical period. And oftentimes after fire, non-native species like cheatgrass and thistles come in and kind of take over. Now, one thing that's occurring, even without fires, is that we are seeing a lot of dead trees being killed by Ips beetles and other things, dying just from direct drought stress. And one of the big questions that people are posing is, what should we do about all those dead trees? Are they a fire risk? I think the answer is yes. If you've got one of those dead trees right next to your fence or your barn or your house, you ought to remove it. However, if you're just looking at the woodland and you don't have any particular infrastructure in the area, you probably don't need to remove those. They probably don't significantly increase the risk of ignition or spread. And the reason is that fires in this system are carried by the live trees as much as the dead trees. In fact, the live trees might even burn more furiously than the dead ones, because the foliage of the junipers in particular contains very flammable chemicals that can release more heat even than the dead trees. So the dead trees are probably not increasing the fire risk unless they're going to burn up a fence or something like that. And I would also add that trying to remove those dead trees, not only is it a lot of physical work, but it can actually do damage on its own right. But you're going to disturb the soil when you go in there. That creates a place where cheatgrass and other weeds can get in. If you do a lot of cutting during the summertime, you may stimulate the beetles and so on. So I think this is another thing that is probably a low priority, and that is removing dead trees out in the middle of a woodland far from infrastructure. I think that's just not something that really needs to be done right away and might even be counterproductive. Okay, let's switch over to aspen forest. By the way, I'm really flying through quickly here because I want to save time for the other speakers. And I'll be glad to go into a whole lot more detail on all of this during the question and answer period, if you wish. So just be sure to ask me. I'd like to talk about two contrasting kinds of aspen forests. And these are the ones that grow at low elevations and on dry sites. Compare those to the ones that grow at high elevations and on more moist sites. And of course, aspen forests are just really, really precious. Down in the right-hand corner is just a handful of the reasons why we love aspen forests as much as we do. I also, before I move on, I want to apologize for that picture in the lower left-hand corner and for those two lovely cows that you see in there. Actually, the cattle are probably a bit of a story, but elk are a much bigger story here than the cattle. And I didn't have a picture of an elk, so I put in the cattle. But I invite you to kind of pretend like they've got antlers on them, because I'll mostly be talking about elk. Let's begin by talking about the low elevation dry side aspen. I think this is probably the type of aspen that is most vulnerable to decline. And I expect you're seeing a lot of this up in the Glade Park area. Two reasons why this is so vulnerable. The first is that they're growing in a inherently warmer and drier environment. They are near the dry, hot edge of suitable habitat for aspen. And so as things get even hotter and drier, these are probably the first ones that are going to feel the pinch from that. And indeed, 20 years ago, throughout the Four Corners region, there was a terrible and sudden aspen decline. They called it sudden aspen decline, or SAD. And it was very widespread. And it was most conspicuous, most widespread on warm, dry sites at lower elevations. So these are vulnerable to climate change. A second reason why these are vulnerable is because most of these forests are within the elk winter range. And as you know, in much of the area, we've had really high elk populations for some time. The elk browse on the young stems and on the new sprouts. And if they browse them intensely enough, like the picture on the right there, they can really prevent the aspen from recovering. Here's one example that we looked at when we were studying the aspen down in the southern end of the Uncompahgre. You can see the fence there. That's a small exclosure that keeps animals out, keeps ungulates out. And we put this up about 5 years before the picture was taken. If you look inside the fence, you can see some small aspens. They're about knee or waist high. Those began growing there right after we put the fence up. If you look outside the fence, there is not an aspen to be seen. Well, actually, that's not true. There are lots of little aspen sprouts outside, but they never grow higher than your ankle because there is so much browsing pressure by mostly elk and deer in this particular site. And this is an example of how the browsing can just prevent regeneration of aspen. But there's more to the aspen story. If we move up to the higher elevations, the more moist sites where aspen grows, actually, this is probably a much less vulnerable type of aspen to decline. It may be not as much of a worry in terms of setting priorities as the low elevation type. And there are two reasons, I think, why the high elevation sites are more resilient and more persistent. And the first is, again, climatic. They're at higher elevations. They're in the moist and cool portion of aspen's range. And so it'll take maybe just a little longer for the warming and drying trends to catch up with these. And indeed, during that sudden aspen decline in the early 2000s, it didn't affect the high elevation aspen nearly as much as it did the low elevation stands. So these, I think, are maybe a little bit less urgently imperiled compared to the others. Another reason why the high elevation moist side aspen are probably less vulnerable is because they're mostly not in the elk winter range. The elk move to lower elevations in winter as the deep snow accumulates. As we know, the Uncompahgre Plateau catches those winter storms as they move in from the Pacific, and they dump a lot of snow up on the top. The snow can be many feet deep, and so the elk largely vacate the area during the winter. Now, elk are there in the summer, and they browse a little bit on aspen in the summer. But in the summer, they tend to prefer the more succulent vegetation, the grasses and the forbs. Aspen is really the most preferred food when all that succulent stuff dries out and is not as nutritious. This would be late fall, winter, early spring. That's when they really usually hammer the aspen. And during that time, they have mostly vacated the high country. So the high elevation aspen are not as available for browsing during those critical times. And that makes them a little bit more resilient. Now, elk do browse on aspen at all elevations. I'd be the first one to say that. We looked at 12 different stands in the south and the central part of the Uncompahgre. And in 2 of those stands, the browsing was more than 90%. And there was just basically no aspen regeneration. It's like that picture I showed you a minute ago. But in 10 other stands that we had randomly distributed across the plateau, actually there was great variability in the intensity of browsing. And in some of those, like where there was only 7% browsing, there was no difference in the growth of the trees between those inside the fences and those outside. In others, the ones inside were growing faster, but doggone, the ones outside were also growing. And so the main effect of the browsing, especially at these higher elevations on these more moist sites, the main effect was just to slow down the rate of growing rather than suppressing it or eliminating it completely. And over here on the left is another picture that makes the very same point. This is a high elevation clear cut that the Forest Service did, I'm not sure how many years ago. And right after the cut, they put a very small exclosure fence in the middle. That's where the trees are so tall. You can see that the trees within the exclosure where they're not subject to browsing are growing faster. But all of those trees and the rest of the clear cut outside are also elongating. They're also growing, and that is going to regenerate a nice stand if it doesn't burn or die from drought or something else like that. So once again, the main point of all of this is that the high elevation aspen is probably more resistant, more resilient than the low elevation aspen, and the low elevation is the one I'm most worried about. So some closing thoughts. Clearly, there's a lot of variability in PJ and aspen forests. Which ones are the most threatened? I don't know, but I'm going to suggest 2 to just start our conversation during the question and answer period. I'd suggest that the first one is the old growth Pinyon-juniper woodlands. Those 300- and 400-year-old trees are dying at what appear to be unprecedented rates. Fires are occurring far more extensively than we think was typical of the historical period, and mortality in general just seems to be unprecedented when you put it into a historical perspective. These woodlands have high biodiversity value, and they appear to be threatened not only here, but across the whole 4 corners. And the other one that I think may be most threatened is the low elevation dry side aspen. They are the first ones to be really feeling the intense effects of drought and high temperatures. And this is where the elk are doing a lot of browsing. 2 last thoughts for aspen that are a little more hopeful. I would remind you that aspen clones, they grow as a clonal structure with a root system, and then stems come off of that extensive root. Those clones can persist for a very long time, decades at least, even when they're constantly being browsed back. So long as the climate remains suitable, we still have those, and if we can improve the other conditions, there's still a chance to bring them back. Also, elk populations do fluctuate over time. We can regulate elk through management. So perhaps the outlook for aspen is a little bit more promising than it is for those old growth Pinyon-juniper woodlands. But the bottom line is, and this again is no surprise, the big threat is climate change, increasing temperatures, increasing aridity. It's probably the biggest single threat to both PJ and aspen on the Uncompahgre Plateau. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to Tony if he is still here. He might have had to leave to take care of a family situation. Are you there, Tony?
I'm here, Bill.
Okay, very good, Tony. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, can you keep it up on your screen? Keep sharing your screen?
I will, and you just tell me when you want me to go to the next slide.
Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. It's good to be here. I'm also an ecologist at Colorado State University, and I just have a few minutes here, a few slides to talk about some management approaches to dealing with a lot of these changes that Bill is talking about, with this future of more drought and higher temperatures and more fires. I'm also going to mention some ideas that we've brainstormed relevant to Glade Park Forest, just to give you some examples that may or may not be relevant on your property. So on this slide here, you're looking at a spectrum of adaptation options, from resistance on the left to transition on the right. And so the resistance and resilience strategies, those green boxes, are an approach to management where you're managing for persistence, where those ecosystems are recognizable, would be recognizable in the future, similar to what they are now. That box on the right, the transition, is where you're managing for change. And so in these next slides, I'm going to dive in a little more detail into the resistance, resilience, and transition strategies, just as a way to, a framework to think about how you can approach this uncertain future. The decision that you make on your property is going to be driven by your values, your management priorities, and how much risk you're willing to tolerate, and if you're more tolerant of short-term or long-term risk. So Bill, you can go on to the next slide. Great. So this first slide is talking about resistance strategies, and these in this scenario, you manage forest ecosystems so that they're able to resist the future or resist the influence of climate change. So in this option, you defend high value ecological, economic, or cultural assets against some of those changes or disturbances. And when I'm talking about disturbance here in this presentation, I'm talking about things like bark beetles and fire. A relevant resistance strategy might be keeping fire out of your Pinyon-juniper forest, or invasive species removal would be another example. Resistance approaches may require intense intervention and more effort and investment over time. So the risk with this approach is high, and it keeps growing in the future as conditions get further from what they are now. So this is best as a short-term strategy and for things of high value. All right, Bill, you can go on to the next slide. So now we're looking at a resilience approach. And the resilience is a little bit different than resistance, because you're allowing disturbances to occur, but you are setting up the system so that it can eventually return to its original condition, or at least some semblance of its original condition. These resilience strategies are focused on the overall health and vigor of the ecosystem. So you might call this like the healthcare option, where you're minimizing stress, you're promoting health, you have backup plans and redundancies. A lot of sustainable forest management falls under this umbrella. Things like thinning or prescribed burns and frequent fire forests. An example that might be relevant to what Bill just talked about would be an aspen. A resilient strategy might be if when the forest burns, you might want to keep livestock out of the aspen for a few years to protect the sprouts and give them a chance to get started. So you're encouraging the recovery of that system. So this resilience options still incur more and more risk through time, and the amount of intervention required to keep the ecosystem similar to what it is now might require more and more intervention. Okay, Bill, next slide. All right, so the last option is transition. And this third option is to help an ecosystem transition or to respond to climate change. This means that you're intentionally accommodating change rather than resisting it. And you have the goal of facilitating ecosystems that are able to respond to environmental change. So you're making an intentional directed change. There's a lot of experimentation. There can be a lot of risk as well with this approach in the short term, especially. And the investment, there's a lot of investment up front, but perhaps less so over time compared to resistance and resilience. Some examples of this might be expanding genetic diversity, or assisting shifts in species ranges by planting in areas that are expected to be suitable habitat in the future, or promoting connected landscapes, or fostering refugia that might continue to be suitable into the future. Some more specific examples might be, if you want to nurture your old growth Pinyon-juniper stands that are of high importance, by maybe you create shaded fuel breaks in strategic locations to help protect those old growth stands, or maybe you consider planting pinyon and associated species on some sites where pinyon isn't currently found, but that likely will be into the future. And then with aspen, an example would be looking at those drier sites where aspen is likely on the way out, and enhancing native shrubs and grasses there as the aspen die out. Okay, Bill, next slide. So that was just a quick overview of some approaches to some adaptation options. I posted this link here because this Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science is where a lot of these ideas originated, and they have these menus on this link here that are they have menus for like forest adaptive management, or adaptive management for wildlife, and the list goes on and on. And there are these lists of strategies that can be really good places to get ideas on what you could do and what might be relevant on your given piece of land. So with that, that's all I had. And I unfortunately have to step out here. Got to go watch the kids here. So I'm not going to be as available for question and answer time, but Bill and Bob and the other speakers, I'm sure can speak to these ideas as well. Thanks a lot.
Kamie Long, who will speak next, is your local State Forest Service representative. So Kamie, are you ready to take off? Okay.
Thank you, Bob. I worked with Bob at the beginning of my career, and he's a great resource, and I'm glad that he's part of this conversation that we're having today. So thanks, Bob. We have a short amount of time to give you a lot of information, so I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to share some quick and dirty on the Pinyon Ips bark beetle. I know you've heard that name a few times. You may have seen it on your property. Just kidding. I know you have. You live in Glade Park, which is significantly hit by these dark beetles, but I want to give you some of the basic facts to help you track what's going on and how to manage it. After me, Patrick Kirian with the BLM is going to talk about wildfire mitigation. So I'm going to get going. See what button I need to push. There we go. So even though we think of them as this big scary thing, bark beetles are native to Glade Park, to Colorado. The Ips bark beetle specifically is native. They are very host specific. And in our case, the Pinyon Ips bark beetle will only attack pinyon trees. They will not attack juniper, or if you call them cedar trees. They are identifiable if you're a true geek and you find a beetle in your tree and you want to figure out if it's an Ips beetle or not. You can see that the behind of these beetles have these little spines, and you actually can see them with the naked eye, these spines. And so that's a real good indicator that it's an Ips bark beetle versus other bark beetles. So they are very tiny. That's my finger in the right-hand picture. of the Ips bark beetle, about the size of a grain of rice, but it's the mass numbers that kill the trees. The mass attack by multiple beetles is what overwhelms the tree's defense system. So what will they attack? They have to be in green material. They have no interest in dead trees or dead branches. It has to be green. It can be standing or on the ground. If you want to cut a green tree when they're actively flying and put it on the ground like this pile of slash at this construction site, they would happily infest that down material that's still green, and they will have a little party as they go in because there's no defense system that the tree can put up because it's already been cut. So as long as there's moisture in that wood, the Ips beetle will and can attack it. They will attack anything over 1 inch in diameter. So that's a lot of the parts of the tree. So what are some symptoms that you can look for? There's 2 main things besides the crown turning that straw color. The image on the left are the pitch tubes, and that's the tree's main defense system, where they're using sap to push the beetle back out the entrance hole that they're trying to come in on. So they're trying to drown the beetle in the sap. It's an orange color if the beetle has been successful and is creating sawdust as they chew through the bark. The sawdust mixed with the clear sap turns orange, and that's the indicator that the beetle has won and has gotten into that tree. With as dry as it's been, the pitch tubes are much smaller than they used to be. That image on the pitch tube on the top of that picture is very small. So you really have to get up close to your trees to be able to see these pitch tubes. In the summertime, you'll see sawdust and frass, which is another word for sawdust that we use, mixed or sprinkled and caught in the bark crevices and at the base of the tree. These beetles push sawdust back out their entrance holes to keep their tunnels clean. So you'll find a lot of sawdust, especially in the summer times. Right now with the wind and the rain and the snow, it kind of gets blown away because the beetles aren't actively pushing the sawdust out. But in the summertime, you'll see this on the tree. An exit hole means that the beetle has left the tree. So you will not see exit holes if they're still active in the tree. But if you do see exit holes and the beetles have left, then the tree has lost, the beetles have finished reproducing, the new generation has come out, and that tree is basically firewood now. So I like to show the differences between holes so you can compare them when you're looking at your trees. The picture on the left, you can tell that those holes aren't perfectly round and they're fairly large compared to the picture on the right-hand side. Those are Ips exit holes. They're about the size of a BB pellet and perfectly round. Again, hard to see. Well, you can't see it from a distance at all. You really have to be standing next to your tree to see these holes. So again, perfectly round, BB pellet sized is an exit hole. If it's not either of those things, it's not round, it's much larger, then it's some other boring insect that was in the tree and finishing its life cycle, but not the Ips. So timing, this is going to be the most important, some of the most important information. The beetles are flying during the summertime and they emerge in the spring when daytime temperatures are above 50 degrees for a couple of weeks. So we're getting close to that. So you don't want to be doing any green tree cutting right now, because when those beetles emerge, you don't want the smell of sap or green material on your property. So again, it's 50 degrees or warmer for a couple weeks. That's their cue, their internal cue that it's time to start coming out of their overwintering trees. Conversely, the beetles will hibernate in the fall when the daytime temperatures are staying under 50 degrees for a couple weeks. And once it stays cool, once that trigger happens and they start hibernating, even if it warms up for a little bit afterwards, they're not going to come back out. They're in those trees to stay for the winter. And so once it's under 50 degrees for a couple weeks, then you can start cutting those green trees because the beetles are hibernating, and any smell creation, any fresh sap smell that you're creating on your property is not going to attract them because they're already in their overwintering trees. I like this photo. This is at that same construction site from that earlier image, but you can really see where the roots of your trees are located. They don't go very deep. They're only in the top 12 to 18 inches. And those roots are what, collect water. It's what stores food. It moves water and food through the system. And if you damage your roots, then you're stressing your tree. And a stressed tree is a favorite thing for Ips beetles to attack. So again, if you have green trees, avoid cutting them in the summer. If you do have to cut a green tree in the summer, you need to remove all tree parts within 2 to 3 days. November to February are good months to cut because that's when those beetles are hibernating and the beetle flights are over for the year. And so you want to make sure that when you're doing that cutting in November to February, that the material will be dry by the time they do emerge in the spring. And that's why I have a February there, even though it's still cold right now. You want to make sure that material is drying out by the time they emerge. So options for removing dead trees, it can be done any time of the year. They don't have Ips beetles in them anymore. Elvis has left the building. I thought that was an appropriate saying for this. It's just firewood at that point. So you can cut dead trees, you can cut dead limbs anytime. And like Dr. Romme was saying, you have to be strategic with what dead trees you're removing because of how much time and effort and energy it takes to remove dead trees. So definitely ones around structures and along egress routes. But this list here is a list of options of what you can do with those dead trees. My asterisk next to burning is to remind you that you need to make sure you're following all local fire department and county restrictions, and making sure you're being smart about the wind and how much moisture or snow's on the ground. Burning's a great option, but you really have to be smart when you do it. So here's the things that I like to tell people is that you can't save every tree. You have to draw a line in the sand and determine what your landscape trees are. And these are the trees that you're going to try to save. And these are the trees that will receive special care, such as supplemental watering in the summer and winter. And in the winter, when the ground's not frozen and there's not water on the ground, you can preventatively spray your trees. And you can do fuel reduction to make the trees that you're keeping healthier because they're not competing. So again, you can't save every tree. So you have to determine which ones you are going to save. So preventative spraying, again, is preventative. Once the beetles are in that tree, it's too late. You can't do anything to save that tree. It's up to the tree to try to protect itself by drowning those beetles in sap. So the preventative spray has to be done twice a year. You want to spray in the spring before the beetles emerge to make sure that when they emerge from their hibernating overwinter trees, that they don't choose your tree as the first tree they attack when they emerge. You spray in the fall to make sure they don't choose your tree to hibernate in. April and August might not be exactly the right dates for months for Glade Park, but I like it because it's easy to remember because those are the 2 months that start with A. So it helps kind of remind me that spring and fall is when you want to spray. And because these beetles can attack anything over an inch, it's ideal to spray all tree parts greater than an inch. But I know our pinyon trees can be big and wolfy and hard to get everything. So at least try to spray the larger branches and the trunk. Again, this is expensive. And so you can't do this to all the trees on your property. So you really need to, again, draw the line in the sand and decide which ones you're going to treat. Read the label, of course. Pheromone packets do not work for Pinyon Ips beetles. They have created them for mountain pine beetle, which attacks ponderosa and lodgepole pine, and the Douglas fir bark beetle, but they have not created a pheromone that will repel the bark beetle, the Pinyon Ips bark beetles. So don't waste your money on buying any pheromone packets because they won't work for Pinyon Ips. So to summarize, if you're going to cut down any infested trees, any green, you don't want to cut any green trees in the summertime. And if you do, you need to remove them from the site. If you find infested trees where you can find the entrance holes but no exit holes, then you can burn, chip, or haul off site those infested trees. You can preventatively spray your high value trees. Consider thinning your property because that will improve the overall forest health and it will reduce your wildfire hazard. And then the fourth thing is supplemental water, especially during the dry seasons before the monsoon comes in, season starts in the summer or in the wintertime when if you haven't had a lot of moisture. The conifer trees are breathing through their needles all year. And if the soil dries out too much and they're still breathing and respirating and losing moisture through their needles, it can be very stressful to them. And a stressed tree is a great snack for an Ips bark beetle. So I'll leave it there so PK can start his presentation. I'll be here to answer questions on that. I know it was a lot of information all at once. So I will send it over to PK.
Hi folks, sorry I'm just getting that loaded here. Hang on for just a second here.
While David loads that, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Patrick Kieran. Some of you I've worked with before. I work for the Bureau of Land Management on the UCR fire. It's the Upper Colorado River Interagency Fire Management Unit, long name. We are the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM. We're a service first fire organization. We don't really see agencies. We only see smoke in the air or helping each other out on field mitigations work and prescribed burning. So what we will cover here is I'm going to be talking about some field management. In particular, I'm going to be talking about Glade Park, Pinyon Mesa. And then we will be also looking at wildfire history up there. And then when you use the word firewise and defensible space, they're somewhat one of the same. So when I say firewise, that's the program, and defensible space, the concept, and the elements and the zones fall under the firewise. So as you can see right here in this first video, this was one of our fires up in 2018. This is in Silverthorne. The red is retardant. We actually had one of those super tankers come in, a DC-10 come in on this. And you can see the swaths. It's kind of hard to see, but you can kind of see the fuel break up to that beetle kill. That was done by the Forest Service all around these properties through Summit County also. So you can see right here, creating all this defensible space saved, I can't even remember, they estimated the value that was saved from this, and it was in the billions of dollars for real estate that was prevented by this one fuel mitigation. So just to show the benefits, do you mind if I try this? Yes, go for it. Okay. Let's see.
There it is. Next slide.
Okay, so first off, check this out. This is the Grand Valley, 1937 aerial view, 1920. Mesa County doesn't have anything for Glade Park at this time frame, but just to show you how we have grown and where some of the footprint is, this is how you guys get to town probably every day. Highway 340 bridge for comparison of what that is. Okay, now this is Glade Park. This here is from 97. This is where the first photos show up on the Mesa County website for aerial photography. So you can see 97 versus 2020. This here is DS Road coming down. This here is Pinyon Mesa to the bottom, to below, and you can kind of see some of this area to the north is kind of going up towards some of the Beale Thompson reservoirs, but you can really see that footprint there of Little Dolores of the green patch. But you can see the difference of what the BLM has done through mechanical treatments on those mesa tops and what wildfire has also done. Not all of this is through fuel treatment, and we'll look at that in just a minute. A lot of the fuel treatment here that has been done by this BLM has been, some of it's been for sage grouse, especially within the last 10 years, and others have just been for large game mostly. So these are the field mitigation projects that have happened in Glade Park just since 2000, okay? Over here is actually the Utah state line. The darker color is going to be all of Colorado, all right? So you can see where we have been working. Once again, we're hitting a lot of those mesa tops, trying to open up some of these more historic sage parks and sage flats where some of that encroachment has been happening. To try to help out, you know, that endangered species, but also other big game. And this next map, we can look, this is from 1975. This is the historical fire print of Glade Park all the way to the west, to the Colorado River. All of these are over 300 acres, and these are all that have been recorded and mapped. You can see how linear they are. As the professor Bill spoke, these are wind-driven fires. So you can really see how they fan out. Oftentimes, you can just by looking at it, you can tell where the origin was and where it pushed to. These are short duration fires, typically 48, 72 hours. Once the winds subside, then these fire behavior really subsides, and then the suppression actions can really start taking hold. As you know, it's Pinyon Mesa, not much fire up there, but if we were to get a fire up in the 12 square, expect that to be a long duration fire, meaning that if it started in July and got big, there would still be smoke until the snow flies. This is a Colorado State Forest Service product. Right here shows this is the fire occurrence that we have. Obviously, the valley bottom where the populace is, where a lot of the cheatgrass, winter wheat is, the fine fuels, you're going to have the higher occurrence. Up here in Glade Park, obviously diminishes a little bit, primarily because of the populace going down. And you can see some areas there, getting closer up to Pinyon Mesa, even less occurrence. Okay, next we have, this is the wildfire risk. This is based off of essentially values at risk infrastructure. You can see all these little pockets of red throughout Glade Park. Those are going to be the areas that most of the residents are, or other things that have been identified values at risk, such as power lines. I don't, if there's any gas, any pipelines, but some of this could be, some of it could be timed towards some of the sage grouse a little bit to the west, as to why some of that's there. And this is where now we see the Cedar Canyon fire now has popped up here. So now we'll have that footprint to look at. This is the fire intensity map. So what this means is when we get a fire, the bright red is going to be the highest intensity, meaning that essentially the wind slope alignment, the way that the fuels, the vegetation maps look, these are the pockets of the areas that will be burning the hottest. And once again, hopefully within just a matter of a few days, once that wind dies down, the fire behavior will die down too. But now you can kind of see where some of these fire intensities are, and if you live in that area. This is the WUI risk. The WUI risk is the wildland urban interface risk. It's essentially where the urban interface, meaning your house, meets up with the wildland. So those are things that we look at as firefighters and fire managers. This is a big thing for us. That tells us that in these pockets, there's values at risk that we need to be concerned about for fire management and fire protection. Obviously, the Grand Valley is going to be much denser. So now we get to the fire-wise and defensible space. What can we do as a resident to protect most likely our most valuable asset, our property? There's steps that we can take that can take as little as 10 minutes a day to, if you have 8 hours on a weekend, that we can take to make that fire-wise and make that defensible space. Because the number one objective of all firefighters is firefighters and public safety. And so if firefighter safety is jeopardized or compromised in a situation, then they may or may not engage in a fire or in a property. And so when we know that a community has done some fire-wise mitigation and fire-wise practices, that really puts firefighters at ease to know that we're going into a situation that could be much more manageable than an area that, you know, is super thick vegetation. We can't get in with our fire trucks and we can't get out. And so there's three real ways that have been identified that wildfires can really threaten your house, okay? First off is we have the direct flame impingement, meaning that the fire actually is coming right up to your house, all right? Directly impinging and burning your house. This photo was taken in 2020. This was a fire in Boulder County, but not the Cameron Peak and not one of the other big ones. All right, second is going to be that radiant heat. It's going to be the heat out here, the heat actually coming from the hot gases, the transfer of heat. And for this one, the radiant heat actually went through the windows on the second floor and then blew out the windows, and then this house burned. So this was not direct flame impingement. This was from that radiant heat transfer. Third is going to be the flying embers. All right, flying embers is typically what can cause houses to catch on fire even hours after the fire has moved through the area. If there's still a pocket of vegetation that burns, embers can land in your vicinity. So even with some of these defensible mitigations, there's other things that we need to look at in our house that can kind of safeguard us from these outside embers. All right, so these are the home ignition zones that we discuss through Firewise. Zone 1 is the 0 feet to 5 feet. The 0 feet means your house itself. What's it made out of? What's the roof made out of it? Is it a metal roof? Is it cedar shake? Do you have a lot of heat traps? Do you have a deck with a heat trap under it? Do you have any mesh or screening over your vents up in the attics, up in the soffits? Those are all things that we look at. And then the 5 feet is, are branches touching? Are they overlapping? Are they coming on? Are they rubbing against my house? Are my gutters full of pine needles? Those are certainly a way to catch a spark. And then the next is that 5 to 30. That's where we start looking at the landscaping. We start looking at, are there wood piles? Are there other firewood piles or other things that we need to look at, that we need to move, rearrange, mitigate fuel around? And then that 300 to 100 feet. 30 to 100 feet. That's where we're going to start looking at that crown density of our trees. We're going to start looking at what we like to do with the BLM is about a 20-foot spacing of our crown density. And so it's not clear cutting everything, and we'll see some photos of here in a minute of how effective mitigation can be without having to clear cut. But we do need to be conscious. If you live on a slope or you think a fire could come from under you, that 100 foot is obviously going to branch out with a wind-driven fire. That 100 foot is not going to be adequate. And so these are things that you need to be thinking of. But we always say start at zone 1, just like anything, it's just baby bites. just one bite at a time. Start at zone 1 and start working your way out. In here, these are the 3 zones and ideas of what you need to be looking at and targeting. Once again, the slideshow is, I think you guys will be able to give this out, so you'll have this. Here's just another perspective, all right, of what we're looking for. This is the home ignition checklist. This is something that you guys probably want to do even this month. Take a look at this, and if you have any time this weekend, you know, it's going to be a little lighter next week after work. Maybe you got an hour. These are just things to kind of just go around and just kind of ticklers to think about. All right, so this is, I'm sorry, does mitigation work? So this was the Long Point fire in Mesa Verde in 2002. This was a lightning fire that smoldered somewhat undetected, and then was a windy day. This single tree that was maybe on the edge of going out naturally, all of a sudden came back to life. Here it is. These are Park Service housing. This is towards the visitor center. This is the aftermath. You can see this is the Park Road. These right here are all the Park Service houses, including the visitor center, including the superintendent's headquarters. So this mitigation work was done. You can see they didn't have to clear cut everything through being able to break up some of that crown density, and probably through some savvy firefighting of being able to burn out around that. They were able to save all structures except for to the very right. Maybe you see a loop that goes to nothing. Well, there was a couple employee houses out there, and those embers came in up into the attic, and those attics got caught on fire. As to why those, but those were all saved from a fuels mitigation project that happened less than a year prior to this fire. Another, that's the backside of it, just another perspective. So when you guys go to the visitor center, maybe you'll notice that there's some greener trees and some bigger trees than others. These are all the links. Even the BLM and Forest Service here in the state of Colorado, we use this NFPA. We also use the state of Colorado itself. They are really kind of taking the forefront with their outreach and mitigation and education stuff. So that's what we use, great outreach. Also, we have the BLM fire prevention outreach, and then the U.S. Forest Service, the fire adapted communities outreach for that too. And Kamie is going to be able to field some questions for me for Q&A. I do have to leave. Dave has my email, so if it's just a Forest Service or BLM question, you can email me anytime, and I'll get the answer for you.
All right, great. Thank you, PK.
All right.
Appreciate you coming here.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
PK's got to take off, and we'll continue where he left off. And we will share these links with everybody, or you can email me directly, and I can get you in touch with PK. Let me start up. I'm going to just start up my version of the presentation here, Alyssa, so I can just continue. Let's see. I want to show this one and the slideshow. That's it. So I want to thank all our presenters for dedicating their time and energy here. It's an evening, a weeknight, and we really appreciate everybody's input here. As many of you all know, the Land Trust has fostered conservation on Glade Park for going on 30 years now, and there are more than 100 properties and tens of thousands of acres are under easement up there. At the same time, increased pressure, development pressure, and environmental stressors like extended drought and beetles have increased, and that's where we find ourselves today. In response, we're trying to take an active role working with landowners to build resiliency on their lands and the Glade Park community in general. This slide shows our service area with the orange circles representing conserved properties. The size of the circle is the acreage of each property, and as you can see, Glade Park up here we have a significant interest up here in Glade Park, and we want to continue that. I want to invite our landowners to continue this collaboration, working with researchers and practitioners on forest health issues and bringing additional management options to the table. We are working with agencies like the BLM and Two Rivers Wildfire Coalition to secure funds for wildfire mitigation work. And since wildfire doesn't respect parcel boundaries, we want to make sure we're coordinating with the Glade Park Fire Mitigation Cooperative that has been very active in the past, very recently active up there. So we're looking for opportunities to collaborate with that group as well. I want to thank everybody for coming, and there's my information. You want to get in touch, and I want to open it up to questions from landowners and other participants. If you have any questions, please raise your Zoom hand, and our moderator Alyssa can kind of moderate the sessions. Or you can type it into the chat, and also if you have a question for a specific presenter, just please feel free to call anyone out. And I'll let Alyssa take over here. Does that work for you, Alyssa?
Yeah, sure thing. If anyone has any questions, like David said, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute at this point. Merce? Merce, you're muted.
Two questions. The first is for using hydroaxing for fire mitigation. The hydroax, as I've seen it, doesn't chew pieces down, generally speaking, to less than 1 inch. So is that not beneficial in terms of the consequences from Ips beetle? And the second one is when you do mulch up trees that you have cut down or hydroax, is that mulch inhibitory to grass growth that it's lying over?
Hi, Merce. Thanks for being here. Good to see you. I did realize I was so anxious to get through my presentation, I didn't really properly introduce myself. So I'll do that real quick. Kamie Long with the Colorado State Forest Service. I'm based here in Grand Junction, and I cover, focus on 5 Western Colorado counties. And I am the Forest Service, like Bob was saying, is we're here to help landowners manage their own land. So I work with the Land Trust closely and a bunch of our other cooperators out here to help you all out managing your land. So to Merce's question, the bark beetle will only attack live or green wood. So if you're masticating in the wintertime, that green, and you're masticating green material in the wintertime, by the time the spring rolls around, that material will be dry and of no interest to them. I would not recommend masticating green material in the summertime. So masticating green material in the wintertime is great. The wood will be dry by the time they come out. The size of the wood is not as important as the depth when it comes to inhibiting the growth of other grasses. So you don't want like when people are just chipping material, we don't want chips in big piles. We don't want anything that's real dense and heavy on the ground. But if with the masticator, they're usually spraying out the chips far enough that you're not going to have a real depth, unless they're, except for that point right where they're probably coming down on the tree, it's maybe a little deeper. So in general, as long as it's not, we say about 4 inches deep, as long as it's not more than 4 inches deep, it's not going to inhibit the growth, and it's going to be keeping the moisture in the soil. So that's good for the vegetation. If anyone else wants to jump in on that part of the answer. Question?
Yeah, this is Bill, and I'll make a comment. And first of all, hi, Merce. Nice to see you again.
Hi, great to see you.
Yeah, yeah. And I would just reiterate what Kamie said in terms of the depth of the material and what it will do to the grasses. I think the key thing is the depth. And I think the 4-inch depth she mentioned is a good general guideline. CSU is just completing a study in cooperation with the Nature Conservancy out in southeastern Colorado, where they experimentally hydroaxed some juniper trees, and then they measured the response of the vegetation, the grasses and things underneath it. And they got before and after measurements to see how that mulch material either suppresses or even encourages the grass. So check back with me in about 6 months. And I think I'll have an article that gives you the answer to that, and it would give you just a little bit more detail on that. Again, good to see you.
All right, I have a poll question. I'm going to launch. Just 1 second. My polls are not working, but I see Kenyon just raised his hand. So Kenyon, if you'd like to unmute.
Thanks, Alyssa. Thinking about aspen for the moment, Mary and I have visited a number of places elsewhere in Colorado and New Mexico where people have tried different experiments to regenerate aspen clones, either by exclosures or coppicing, clear cutting, and mostly what we've seen some sites of incredible success, but they also required enormous sums of money and just couldn't be done at scale to build, elk exclosures that'll last for years, or piles of wood of down aspen that are so tall that they exclude elk. But aside also from the practicality question is, not all areas of aspen are the same, and so what we've seen in the San Luis Valley or the mountains there, compared to Glade Park, or even one side of Glade Park compared to the other, they're probably different enough conditions that I would guess there's not a single answer as to how to try to regenerate aspen. And so I'm wondering, what we might do, given a lot of us have high country aspen that are not doing well, to try to get the right resources to come look at our local conditions and advise us as to, what our options may be. Is that a state forestry thing? Is that a CSU thing? Is it Forest Service?
So this is Kamie. I definitely would say it's at least part would be me coming out and meeting with you on site. And honestly, a lot of the answer is trial and error, trying different things and see what the best success is. But you're right, it doesn't come with a small price tag. And there's not a lot of grants out there to do aspen management right now. There's a lot of fire mitigation grants out there right now, because that's the big sexy thing out there, but aspen management isn't up there, which is frustrating for everybody. But I'd be happy to come out. I know you've worked with Retta Brugger, and I've given her some information to pass on to you. So I'd be happy to meet with you guys out there.
Great.
So Kenyon, one of the questions would be,
a lot of people, it's not just us, it's surely a lot of the high country owners in the area as well that would be interested.
Yeah, I've worked with the Kings up there.
and do you have elk issues up there?
We definitely have elk, but the area's also historically had a lot of cattle, and I don't know, you know, it's hard to say who's responsible for what.
Say, this is Bill. Can I chime in? Are you there?
Yeah, we can hear you, Bill. Go for it.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't get my hand. I couldn't get my hand up for sure. Kenyon and Kamie, what you say is so true. There have been a lot of things tried for protecting those those aspen stands to allow them to regenerate, and there has been very mixed success. I have visited some sites down near Chama, New Mexico, where they piled the slash around the aspen, and boy, a couple of those just regenerated beautifully, and a couple of them didn't do well at all. And there was another one where they didn't build the piles, and it regenerated there in spite of elk. So what I'm leading up to is I think this would be a really important project to take on, to do some experimentation, to see what works and what doesn't work under different conditions. And I mentioned the Western Ranch Management and Ecosystem Stewardship Program. In addition to our educational program, we also have a research component. And the intention there is to do applied research in response to landowners' questions and needs. We don't have money sitting there ready to go on something like this, but we would be most happy to work with you folks there in the Glade Park area to find some funding sources. And we could then engage students, and we could draw on some of the other resources of the university, remote sensing and those kinds of things. And I think there might be a really good opportunity to do a nice, fairly thorough study to explore these different strategies under different conditions and see what might work for people throughout that whole north end of the Uncompahgre. So contact us if you'd like to look into that.
Great, thanks, Bill. Mary, I see you have your hand raised if you'd like to unmute.
I just wanted to say thank you to all the presenters and you, Alyssa, and also Bill, we'd be very interested in having some of your researchers come, particularly to our high country. So we should definitely be in touch about that. I don't know if everybody's hearing me or what.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah,
Mary.
we hear you.
Yes, that sounds great, Mary. And let's be in contact over the next couple of days.
Okay.
All right, I've got a hand raised from M. Mayo, if you'd like to unmute.
All right. Hello. I had a couple things. One on the aspen. I've got a small stand of aspen around a spring, and the spring is still, flowing. So they have plenty of water. I mean, they're basically standing in water almost. And then I've got some aspen around my house that gets supplemental water. And I had die off on both places, and I took some stuff down to a local nursery, and what it was aphids. It was like an oyster scale aphid. So I wondered if you'd seen that anywhere, or is that unique to me? But it just seems, it's definitely not because of drought in this case.
So oyster shell scale is more of a landscape issue, is where I've seen it. I haven't very much seen it in the native trees. So that is interesting to see or hear about. But it can be a stress. So just because they have enough water doesn't mean that there's not other stress factors. Too much water can also be a stress factor, just as not enough. And also the temperatures can be a stress factor. Did they give you some treatment on how to manage the oyster shell scale?
Yeah, I mean, they did like a dormant oil spray, and then just if you visually see them, they come out like in May to June, and if you just actually put a pesticide, on them while they're crawling around, you can
Yeah.
get, and I think I've gotten rid of them around my house, but just obviously too big of a problem to do, out beyond that.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting to hear that you're experiencing that. But it can be a sign of stress from other factors, which isn't necessarily helpful, but.
Then I've also got a second problem with the pinyon trees. I think it's called a twig beetle, or it's something that just kills like individual branches into branches. That's also, I'm sure you guys are aware of that, but I just wondered if there was any way to mitigate those, or what that was.
The twig beetle could be managed the same way as the Pinyon Ips bark beetle, with the chemical or the preventative chemical spraying, but you have to obviously spray the tips of the branches, the twigs, for it to work. I would have to do some more research to remember if they're the same kind of life cycle or as the Pinyon Ips, which has 4 or 5 generations per year, or if you would just need to spray once. But I have a feeling they're probably pretty similar to Pinyon Ips. We used to say that they weren't tree killers because they would just attack a few branches, but I have, due to the drought, seen them kill trees. So that's not great. But yes, the twig beetle, you would treat it the same as a Pinyon Ips, where you would preventatively spray, and if you can, water, and remove other trees from around to reduce competition for resources.
One last thing. There's also some juniper trees that are dying. So I'm not sure what that is, because they've obviously been alive for a long time. So I would think that they've been through drought cycles, but it's something, it seems to start with maybe, like one branch and then it'll spread, and some trees survive it and just some branches die, and some of them are, die completely. So I'm sure that that's happening too.
You're not alone. And I've emailed our state entomologists over the years to see if they had an answer, and the answer is there's not one reason, which makes it kind of harder. You can't point your finger at the Ips or the twig beetle. It's a combination of environmental factors, and there's a couple different borers that will attack them. And so you're right. I think it's the health of that tree and whether they can fight off all of the things, or if it's just too much and they die under all the stresses. And there's never been a good answer that I've been given on how to manage that. And so I was kind of smiling when you were saying that, because I hear this a lot, and it's always so frustrating because I don't have an answer on how to treat that.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, Alyssa, I think we have a question here in the office.
Yeah, this is probably for Kamie or Bill. When I cut these pinyon trees down, I mean, they're dying in clusters. There'll be like, anywhere from 8 to 15 of these trees in one area, and they'll all turn brown basically within a month of each other. And so I've been cutting them down, and every one of these things has these like white worms that are inside the bark. They're about maybe a 1/4 inch long. It almost looks like the mealy worms you would take fishing. And today, as a matter of fact, one of the trees I cut down, there was probably 30 of them around the base of that tree, inside the bark. And when you cut them down, that bark peels right off. And these trees also, the bark is falling off on the upper limbs. They turn brown, and then you see where the bark is just falling off the tree. Is this an Ips beetle, or is there some other kind of beetle that's doing this? And then the second part of my question is, that's what they look like right there. The second part is, when I've been cutting these trees down, I mean, I don't have there's no way to get a chipper or anything, a piece of equipment up there. I'm brush piling, making brush piles out of the dead limbs. And they're scattered all over my property. I mean, I don't have any other way to do it. I'm not going to burn it because the whole place will go up. But I want to know if that's the right thing to do or just spread that stuff out. I'm looking for an answer on that.
Sure, I'll go first, and Bill, I'm sure you'll have something to add to it. So what you are seeing is the longhorned Sawyer beetle. And those are those big black beetles with the long antennas that make a lot of noise when they fly around.
Okay.
That's what you're seeing.
They smell like pine when you squash them.
I have never smelled one.
Well, it's pretty hard not to because they're very pungent.
I've had them land on me before.
But they do smell, let me tell you.
So these are the images when I pulled black horn Sawyer beetle up. This is what you're the larva that you're seeing.
Right there.
Yeah, that guy. And so those are just decomposers. They're secondaries. They're coming in after the tree has kind of been pushed over the edge by the Ips bark beetle. We call Ips bark beetles primary killers because they can take a healthy tree and kill it. These Sawyer beetles will only come into stress trees. And the stress can be multiple reasons, but in your case, it's the Ips bark beetle being the significant stressor. So those are Mother Nature's way of decomposing in our very dry climate. So that's what you're seeing with those guys. And what you're doing with, we call your management treatment that you're doing called lop and scatter, where you're lopping off the branches and you're scattering them across the landscape area. And that is a perfectly fine way to manage the material in the situation where you can't bring a chipper in and you don't want to burn. The key thing is you do not want your scatter, when you scatter those limbs across the landscape, to be much higher than your knee in depth, because you want the snow to compact those branches down over time to start to get, the more contact they can have with the ground, the sooner they'll start decomposing. So that's why you don't want it too deep. One, so they start decomposing. Two, so they're not a big fire hazard. But we do this in forest management a lot when we don't have a better option of removing the material or turning it into chips.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Bill, did you want to add to that, or Bob?
I'll just real briefly underscore what you said, Kamie. That longhorn beetle reminds me that there are lots of insects that take advantage of dead trees, and that's just one of them. And so you're going to see a lot of beetles and a lot of activity, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily kill the tree. And generally the tree was killed by Ips, or it might simply have succumbed directly to drought. When trees are stressed, this would apply to pinyon and to aspen. Again, there are things that come into really severely stressed or recently dead trees. There are fungal diseases, there are all kinds of things. And oftentimes you'll find those in your dead or dying trees, but they're not necessarily what's killing them. And I think in these times of climate change, that very often the underlying factor is drought and high temperatures, and that's what's stressing the trees and killing them. And then all these other secondary decomposers are coming in after them. So just to underscore what Kamie said. And in terms of lopping and scattering the dead material, what Kamie said, I think, makes perfect sense. That's probably the best way to handle it. I would just add that if it's difficult to get up there to where those dead trees are, consider just leaving them. Dead pinyon tend to kind of disintegrate by themselves within 10 or 20 years, and they'll just fall on the ground, and they'll create a little bit of fuel and dead material, but you can look at that even as wildlife habitat for some species. The dead junipers will stand for a very long time. They might just be landscape elements that, again, they're probably not posing a great threat. And if you dislike the look of them, then cut them and lop and scatter them. If the appearance doesn't bother you, consider just letting them be and focus your attention on maybe more urgent things.
Yeah. So walking my property, and Diana, I pointed this out to her, at some point there was a pretty good fire there. Almost all of the cedar trees show scorch marks on the underside of the limbs. And there's like a significant difference in size of the pinions. You know, there's some real small ones, and then there's some huge ones that are like 30-inch diameter trees. And all of them show, you know, all those bigger trees show where a fire had gotten them. And talking to my one neighbor that's been there since the early 70s, no one can remember when there was a fire there. But there's burned out, you know, pinyon trees and cedar trees there.
You know, I would love to see that spot, because you don't see very many places where the big pinyon trees have survived a fire of any size. And in terms of nobody remembering when the fire was, it could well have been in the 1800s. I know a number of places where there's clear evidence of a fire in the past, and the old timers don't remember. They don't know when it happened. Again, it shows how slowly those Pinyon-juniper woodlands generally recover after a fire. So I find this very intriguing.
There's cedar trees that are probably 3.5 to 4 feet in diameter that are still relatively healthy, but you can see where they've been burned. And there's the pinyon trees, the ones that I think were in the fire, they don't grow straight. They grow off at an angle, kind of twisted. And I don't, you know, I assumed that's probably what happened to them. They were damaged during that fire. But these particular trees that are like that, they're 20-inch diameter trees at the trunk. It's pretty interesting to see that.
If we manage to get out to the area, if it'd be all right with you, I would love to have you show me that place, because that's quite intriguing. What is your name again?
Dennis Owen, O-W-E-N.
I'm sorry, I don't have a quick answer for you, but I am intrigued.
You know, anytime you make it over here, let me know. We'll go take a walk.
Great.
You got it. Thank you.
All right. We're winding things down here, but I just want to show one. You know, as you all know, we sent out a survey, and some of the survey respondents asked a few questions, and I just want to show you some of those questions here. Maybe they can be addressed real quickly. So I think, you know, one of the things we got is people exasperation. You know, what can I do is one of the main questions, and I'm not expecting the experts to answer that. But yeah, another question here is like cutting down this Pinyon-juniper. Are we doing the right thing? There's been a lot of attempts to do the right thing on this particular ranch, and probably all of these ranches. Only later do we learn that we did the wrong thing. And who can help us? Who out there can help us look at the whole big picture and decide which course to take? Now, I'd like to think that Bill did a great job giving us the big picture here. But I think we can sympathize with this question, the person asking this question as well. So any of our presenters who want to talk about that at all, the big picture and how to, you know, is it the right idea to manage these forests in this way? I wonder if we can, anyone would like to speak to that.
Well, this is Kenyon. This is Kenyon. I think, you know, Bill, going back to that letter that you wrote 20 years ago that caused us to reach out to you. You know, I think the thing we found so interesting about it was that you were saying, unless there's imminent danger of fire, you know, risk to a structure or something, it might not be the best, and it might even be worse to remove the dead pinyon because of the ground disturbance, and then cheatgrass comes in, which increases the fuel load and all these things. And, you know, I've heard a lot of people in the Glade Park area refer to how many hundreds of dead pinyons they've removed off their property. It's definitely something that people do and seem to be doing more and more of. And so it makes me wonder if we think that might actually be making the problem worse, not to mention it's a lot of work, should we be trying to have that discussion at a broader level and passing the word along in the community?
I'll just add a quick comment to that. And first of all, say, I don't know. I don't have a lot of ready answers. But one approach to take to get some better answers is to make some notes about things, to take some photos of things, and then go back a year or two later and take a look and see how it turned out. And I'm sure a lot of folks in the area are doing that in an informal way, but we might think about doing something a little bit more formal. For example, photo points are really nice because they're pretty quick, they're inexpensive. You do need to permanently mark where they are so you can go back and you can see what the response is to whatever treatment you did, whether it's cutting trees or removing trees or whatever. The other thing is, when you set up photo points like that, regard it as a scientific experiment. And if you're going to treat an area, say by cutting the trees, don't treat the entire area the same way, but leave one area where you don't treat it and take pictures of that before and after to see if there's a difference between the treated area and the untreated. So for example, if you're concerned that cutting those trees might enhance invasion by cheatgrass, for example, if you take a picture and there's no cheatgrass and you cut some trees and you come back the year later and it's full of cheatgrass, well, it's important to have a picture of a comparable area that you didn't cut, because if that's full of cheatgrass as well, then the cheatgrass may not be there because of your treatment. It may be there because you had a lot of fall moisture that stimulated a lot of dormant seeds to grow. So I'm just making up these examples, but the point is, I think there would be value maybe in talking among the community and maybe with the Forest Service and the CSU folks about doing some little experiments where we try different treatments, building brush fences around aspen, cutting trees that have been killed by Ips, and set up some photo points and make a plan to go back and revisit those and really evaluate the effects of our treatments. And I think that's the way we can begin to advance our understanding of what's happening and of how most effectively to deal with it.
I'll jump in on this too. This is Bob. You know, nature isn't always beautiful. We're seeing that now with the recent fires, that there's mass acres of dead trees, of burned trees. And, you know, this, to the human eye, this is not pretty, this is ugly. But nature doesn't have feelings like we do. I used to manage the Colorado State Forest, and when we did the inventory of the forest, we found out that almost every tree was the same age for the whole 72,000 acres. And what we found out is that a fire went through there back in the 1870s and pretty much wiped out the whole mountainside. And I'm sure those days it was not the best looking area, but 100 plus years later, it was a beautiful area and something we'd love to see. Now it's 80% dead because of mountain pine beetle. But 100 years from now, it'll be different again. So we're going through these transitions all the time. We're not sure what it's going to look like in 100 years. But because a tree's dead, it's not the end of the world. It's just part of the system. We need to decide what our priorities are. Is it to have all our trees green? And if there's not green, you take it out? Or is it we're going to protect our houses and our infrastructure from fire and try to keep the trees around our homes green and let the nature do its thing beyond that? Again, there's not enough money in the world to keep everything green and healthy all the time. It's priority setting and dealing with nature as it does its thing.
All right, that's a good point, Bob. Thanks for making that. If no one else has anything to say about that, I want to maybe just answer this third question here, or address it here.
David, this is Bill. I might add one real brief thing to what Bob said. That is so correct. There are changes occurring in the forest. And I want to go back to that slide Tony showed as one of the adaptation strategies as transition. You know, some of these changes we probably cannot prevent. In many cases, the best we can do is to try to nudge them into a direction that will give a more desirable and more sustainable future. But it's probably not realistic to think that we can prevent all of these changes. So I'll be quiet and let you continue, David.
Okay, no, that's a great point. Thanks for saying that. And we'll wrap up real quick. I don't want to keep people over. It's been a long day for everybody, I'm sure. But this is a real practical question, I think. Is it bad to bring beetle kill pine onto my property? This was from a landowner that helped another landowner kill or cut up some of the beetle kill and then brought it onto his own land where there isn't a lot of beetle kill. And from what I heard, I'm going to go out on a limb, Kamie, you can correct me if I'm wrong. By the time the beetle kill pine is dead, and the beetles are not a problem anymore, so they have left. So Kamie, do you want to address that real quick?
Right, that's my Elvis has left the building slide. So you're out on a limb pun was correct. You'll be bringing, there will be, like Bill said, other insects in there, but they're not the primary killers. So a lot of people will build homes out of saw logs or put in wood features in their homes, and then they'll find boring dust in their house. And that's because unless the wood is kiln dried, there's going to be some insects in that wood. And so as long as you're not transferring wood from the East Coast to here or here to the East Coast, you don't want to be transferring firewood across state lines. But if you're still on the same Pinyon Mesa or Glade Park, then yes, it's just it's dead trees is just firewood, no Ips beetle.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Unless anyone has any last minute questions, I want to thank everybody for participating. Kamie, you're a big help. Everyone up there at CSU, really appreciate your participation here, and all our landowners for logging on. I'll be following up with certain individuals later. Christina, looking for ways to collaborate with your group. And like I said, bringing resources to address some of these issues. So thank you all very much, and have a good evening.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.